Welcome back to another FoxVox tutorial. In this video we're going to talk about the Unleashed update to version 2.0 that adds in a lot of new functionality with respect to joystick, key, and mouse inputs, along with the previously handled voice input that FoxVox had implemented. If you hadn't had an opportunity yet to go see the first video, the introduction on FoxVox, then I highly recommend you watch that first to gain some familiarity with how the software functions and the flow and kind of the rhythm and routine of how things are. 2.0 keeps that, and the voice components of it are all very much the same, with the added new features of the key, joystick, and mouse controls as well. When you first launch version 2.0, you'll see that the program looks and feels pretty much the same as it did in previous versions. There's not a lot of change in the visual appearance other than on the main toolbar you have another button for opening a test window directly. There's several new settings that have been put into the software. But the biggest thing to take note of is the little toggle button just underneath the library name. And that allows you to switch between voice or keyboard, joystick, HID control. So by toggling between the two, you're toggling between two actual different systems of input that FoxVox supports. On the voice control, of course, you're going to be mapping your voice inputs to the outputs for voice execution. But on the keyboard, you're going to be doing that same thing, only with key binding. Associated with each one, they are different configurations, so you've got a different color scheme between the two. So if you want to keep a different look, so when you're on the key, you can see that, make it a little bit more visually dynamic in terms of the change, you can do that. As far as configurations go, they each store their own configurations as well. So you'll have key configurations designed for your keys, and you'll have voice configurations designed for your voice. And they are separate and distinct based on which one. Now they do run simultaneously, so you can do both key input and voice input. But they do have their own configurations to make it a little bit easier for you to control how they're being executed. So we'll get into a lot of the changes here in just a moment, but you'll also notice once we start creating key command groups that we're going to get another button up on the toolbar, and that button is going to allow you to turn on and off the key recognition just like you could with the voice recognition. So you can have keyboard and voice recognition input simultaneous, turn one off, turn the other off, and that can all be handled by new command settings as well. Okay, let's get started into some of the details by first creating some initial key bindings that we want to send for our test application. I'm going to start by creating a new key command group and add our first key command. So all you have to do is move the input or click the button that you want, and if there's any inputs that you don't want to include, you can click the filter button to remove them from the window. If you want to get them back, just click the clear filter. In this case, let's click the button that we want, button 1, and use that. Capture the A key, so we're going to send out the A key. Let's add another command. In this case, we're going to go with button 4. This is going to send a B key. And let's add one more for purposes, in which case we're going to do a combination of buttons 1 and 4. And that's going to send a C to our output. Okay, so we've got 3 commands here, button 1, 4, and then a combination of button 1 and 4. To enable key recognition, we have to click the keyboard enable up here at the top of the menu. And let's open up a test window so that we can see the output. Okay, so when I click on button 1, you see that sends an A. Button 2 sends a B, and when I click both together, it sends a button C. Perfect. Now that we've got some buttons defined, let's talk about some configurations and settings that we can do. Perhaps we don't want just a single press, but we want to adjust the way that we interact with our buttons in order to execute our commands. You do this by clicking on the settings, the little icon that's indicated next to the button label. Click on that, and it'll bring up the settings associated with that button. In this case, the first thing we have is a press count. And this chooses basically how many times we have to click the button in order to activate it. So if you want to do for example, let's just say we want to click this 3 times in order to activate the command, you'll see a little count which shows you the current count appears up next to the control so that you can see how many you're doing. And let's take a look at that. And you can see I have to click it 3 times now instead of just twice to get it to go. We can turn that off. Let's say also if we want to do a delay, we can change the delay between presses. It's kind of like your double click speed on a mouse, basically how fast you want to click between them. If it's not registering or if it's too low, you can increase that, or if you find that the delay is too high and you want to reduce that, you can lower that as well. Finally, you've got a delay here that changes the duration which you must hold the input. So once you've activated the input, if you want to require that you maintain that input down for X number of milliseconds, you can do that here. So this is kind of a press and hold to activate, and you set the timing on that press and hold. Another option that you have is a latch. You can turn a latch on and off, in which case after you press the button, that will enable, and the button becomes enabled indefinitely until you press it again, and then another click, and then another click to deactivate. So it has basically a latching behavior. With the latch, you can have a latch timeout. So you can say that, once it's latched, I want it to then let go of the latch and release after so many milliseconds. You can also set that there when that's enabled. And you can also convert it to an on-up or on release. So if you don't want it to be on the down of the click, you want it to be on the up side, you can enable that here. Aside from individual button settings, which you can put on every button, you can also then control how the command executes with the command settings, including repeat and timeout settings. Those are accessed next to the enable-disable button up at the top of the command. Click that and you'll get a menu that gives you the settings on the command itself. The first one we're going to talk about is the run limit. So the run limit is the maximum number of times that you can run the command. If you have it 0, it can run indefinitely. This is good if you want to stop execution or disable. It effectively disables the command after it's been executed so many times. Probably don't want that so much when it's bound to a number output like the A key or something, but if you're playing sound files or doing other tasks, you may only want to execute that task a certain number of times, once or a few more times, in which case you could limit it. And when we set that limit, notice when we go ahead and do that, after it's run, I can continue clicking that button. The command, you'll see the icon on the limit turns red, telling you that it's maxed out on its repeat settings. If you click on that, you can see that there's a little button here. You can reset that internal counter to 0 so that it'll run again, but it's locked out. And then once I run it again, it's continued to be locked out at that point. You can also reset all of the locked out commands by disabling and then re-enabling the key activation. So that's kind of a handy feature if you're trying to do things just a certain number of times. Okay, so besides the run limit, the next setting we have is deconfliction delay. Deconfliction is basically an algorithm that I built into FoxVox that would designate or separate between commands that have the same buttons. In this case, we have several commands using button 1. We have the first one, which puts out the A, and we have this one, which puts out the C. This one is combined with button 4, and you'll notice when I press the buttons, when I press button 1, I get an A. When I press both keys, I get a C. You wonder why we didn't get both an A and a C. That's because of deconfliction. The deconfliction, it detects that, yeah, I fulfilled all the requirements on this command, so it knew that I wanted to run the combination rather than just an individual button, which is pretty cool. You can change the deconfliction delay. Let's clear out our settings. We can change the deconfliction delay and put it down to 0 to remove it if we want, and then we'll have behavior, which I've seen in a lot of other systems where when one button is activated, that would activate the command for both. So in this case, if I press both buttons simultaneously, I get an A and a C immediately because the deconfliction has been disabled. So normally, by default, it is enabled, and the delay that's specified here really represents how in close proximity and time-wise you press both buttons. Inevitably, when you're pressing a button on the joystick, it's impossible to press two buttons exactly simultaneously. One gets pressed before the other. At the speed at which computer registers, it's practically impossible, and especially with registering, you'd be lucky if you could do that on a consistent basis. So the delay between pressing 1 and pressing button 4 together is what we use for the deconfliction delay. And 70 milliseconds, that's a very short time frame. It's just a fraction, but it's enough to be able to differentiate between the two. If you find that you need a little bit more because the buttons are far away from each other and you're not able to press them quite in sync, you can increase that delay. Or if you feel like there's too much of a delay or lag between the output, if that button is too high, you'll notice that it'll take a long time before the button registers, or a longer time. You can reduce that. But that's deconfliction. It gives you the ability to choose between which button is pressed when you've got buttons in combination. Another setting that we have available on the commands then is the repeat. Of course, you'll see when I click the button one time, and if I squeeze and hold, it only puts it out one time for each click. So that's the default behavior, but of course, sometimes you want to be able to press a key and have it automatically repeat. So to do that, we go into the repeat settings, enable them. You can change, the repeat start delay. There's a default time in which you must hold the button before repeating starts. I do recommend that, otherwise repeating begins instantaneously, and that may or may not be a problem. But the repeat delay is also default to 0, which means it's relatively fast. So I'll show you here, once that repeat starts going, you'll get a lot of presses very quickly. That can also be a problem. So you may want to change the repeat delay, increase that. And you can go ahead and we'll set it to 0 with a repeat delay of, actually let's up it to about 20 milliseconds. And you can set a repeat limit. Let's do that in a minute, but let's first check out the delay settings. Okay, so now you can see it repeating at a much more reasonable rate. Again, set that as fast as you want or as slow as you need. And if we set a repeat limit, then it should stop executing once we achieve that limit. So I press and hold, but once it hits that count, it no longer continues. Now if I release before it gets to that count, it will also disengage. So the maximum is the maximum number of times it can repeat before it stops. Now, so far we've looked at just simple, straightforward button presses as well, but FoxVox, of course, does support analog and treats them a little bit differently, gives you a little bit of control as well. So let's take a look at that. First, I'm going to create a new group. And let's bind to an analog. In order to do that, just simply move the axis to the analog value you want to capture. In this case, actually, I don't want these. Let's remove the things we don't want, and let's choose our little rotate axis here. Okay, so once we have an axis set up, you'll see that you have a lot of similar things with a press count, a delay. This is treated every time that it moves into the active range. And the active range is set right here on the analog. So by default, it goes between 1 and 100, so disabled at 0 and pretty much active over the entire range. But you can adjust that. You can drop it down to a 0. Let's just say we want to go on one side of the axis. And you can accommodate for a dead band. So if in the center area you have a little bit of noise or a not so good refined control, you can kind of move out of that. And you can set as many active ranges on an analog stick that you want. So if you want to have it on the top end and at the low end, you want it to both be active, you can do that. But basically, if the analog is moved into any of the active ranges, then the command will be considered active. Okay, so it gives you a lot of control over the analog, which I like. Okay, and then once you start moving the axis, once it goes into range, you'll see it give you a track of the current value that it's reading, which is really nice. Okay, but other than that, axes are treated with all the same outputs and configurations and settings that you can do with regular buttons. And then, of course, you can set your command settings if you want to have your command repeat and do different things. So for analog settings, one of the things that I also wanted to be able to do was to be able to use a cursor or a joystick control for moving my mouse. And that's a common thing you want to be able to achieve. So I put in some special abilities into FoxVox to be able to do that. I just want to kind of go over that here while we're talking about the analog. First thing, what we need to do is we're going to add 4 executions, one for up, down, left, and right. So let's go ahead and bind that to our axes here. And we're going to want to use the y-axis. And in fact, let's go ahead and capture the x-axis while we're doing it. I'll show you how I do things quickly. So I'm going to put the x-axis here, put the y-axis here, delete it. Okay, so we've got 4 axes. Let's set this one to our lower range. And I'm going to actually go with 46. And we're going to set this one to 52 to 100. So I've left a little bit of a dead band in the middle. I think actually let's do a consistent dead band to 4. And the same thing on our axe. Trying to think which direction it goes. And if you don't know, you'll be able to see that later. Sometimes sliders can be finicky. Okay. So now, let's see, we've got up and down on the Y, and I've got left and right on my X. Okay, so this is going to want to be up. So we're going to go ahead and add a mouse move. And you can do the mouse movement with this little pad here. We're going to do a mouse move up. And then this number in the center sets how the pixel distance to move. If you increase this, it's going to increase the sensitivity. It defaults to 1, which is the minimum sensitivity, and I actually think that's a good thing because we're going to assign some motion curves to it and let those control it. But you can adjust it and increase it here if you want. If you hover over the little move designator, you can see how much it's going to move. In this case, it's coordinates. It's going to move left 0, so not on the x-axis, but it's going to move on the y-axis -1, which is up. Okay, so we've got this. This is our up. And let's go ahead and add the rest. Okay, so now go ahead and save what we've got. We should be able to get some mouse motion. Okay, so the mouse is moving, but again, I didn't turn on repeat, so it only moves 1 pixel at a time. Let's go ahead and we want repeat to be engaged. And we don't want a delay in this case. We want it to start moving immediately. Let's do that on all of our axes. Okay, let's see if we've got motion control. And yes, we do. You can see that at the 1 pixel motion, it's pretty slow. So we want to adjust this. Okay, so there's a special thing built in whenever we're doing a mouse move and it's bound to a single axis on an analog, FoxVox is going to open up a couple settings just for mouse control. It knows what we're trying to do here. So first off, we can say whether or not our axis is inverted and choose how we want it to do that. In this case, I don't think so, but if your axis was inverted, you could switch that here. The other thing we want to do is control the motion sensitivity. 0 is our default. We're going to leave that at that for now, but let's go ahead and apply a curve. You've got a choice between a linear, quadratic, cubic, or exponential extrapolation, and my preference is the exponential, but you can play with those to see which ones you like the best and how it affects it. But what this is going to do is give us faster speed when we move the axis further and slower speed when we're slower, so we have the refined control that we need, but that high end speed. Okay, so now look at our curve. It's actually getting slower as I go up. You notice that the higher I press, the lower the number. So I do want to invert this one. And for the x-axis, let's see, it's getting slower as we go further. So that one is inverted as well. Okay, so now it feels a little bit better. Now it's not quite so slow, and as I move the stick, but you can see it's still a little bit slower than I like. I want to increase the sensitivity. So let's go back in here. Let's give that a nice 3. You can adjust this to whatever you want. If you adjust it to a number less than 1, so 0.5, you'll actually reduce the speed of the movement. So you can go that way as well if you find that it's too fast. Okay, so now my high end is going to be much quicker and went right off the screen there. But when I just actuate the joysticks just a little bit, I have refined control. But if I go high, it goes quickly. So motion curves make it a lot nicer to control your mouse cursor using your joystick. Now, probably is going to take a little bit of time to build up the muscle control. In order to do that, I'm not really used to controlling the mouse with an axis, but FoxVox certainly lets me be able to do it. So we've covered creating standard buttons and analog buttons, and really you can see in FoxVox it's pretty simple and straightforward. The combination of settings gives you a lot of flexibility, but you can really control how you want these to operate. But I do want to talk about some of the changes that have been made to outputs. And outputs are shared between the voice input and between the key controls. There's really no difference, and you just set up the outputs the way you want them. But there's a lot of new features that have been added to those outputs, so I kind of want to go through that. One of the things you can do, besides just the mouse outputs, you can see that's been augmented with the motion capability and everything, but there's a lot of these settings down here. Some of the things you can do now are in an output, you can cancel all outputs currently running before proceeding with an output. So this is good if you want to stop whatever was, if you've got something that's timed or was actuated and you want it to end with the output at a particular time, you can assign that on an output by clicking it and enabling it. Another thing you can do is kind of the opposite. You can stop any further outputs from running on this command. So that'll prevent any on the command, if you have other outputs that would follow after this, that would prevent them from going. You can also choose how many times that it would have to actually have the command executed before this command becomes active. So you can set timing on that. And then on the other side, you can say how many times the command sequence can run until it becomes disabled. So you can choose when it activates and also when it deactivates, giving you a lot of flexibility on the commands, all features that we didn't have before. And here's another interesting one as well, and chance. You can assign a % chance that this command will run. Kind of provides something really unusual. So I'm going to do a demonstration over this in just a moment. But first, let's get through a couple more of the settings that we've got. Something you can do now with a command, before you could do these with your voice, but now with the key inputs, I've brought a lot of these things into the command output possibility. You can disable or enable key recognition or toggle its current state. You can also switch the key configuration that's been assigned. And then you can also do the same thing with voice. You can turn the voice recognition on, turn it off using keys, or you can toggle its state. You can also assign the voice configuration that's available or currently running on an output. So an output, remember, can be assigned to any key, any button, any analog, any voice command. So you can use any of those to assign and make any of these changes. You can also, on voice, you can turn listening on or off without actually disabling it, which is important because if you actually turn voice recognition off, voice commands are gone and you won't be able to turn it on via voice. But you could resume listening if you wanted to using a voice command. And then finally, we have the run command, which allows you to execute or open any file within the file system. Okay, so your capture buttons have been moved up here, and these are pretty much the same, but there has been a little bit of reorganization in order to make room for these new settings. And now I'm going to give you an example of just what they can do here and why we have some of these. The first thing I wanted to demonstrate here is the use of switching between configurations to be able to control how things operate, which basically gives you a whole lot of flexibility with respect to which keys are active at a time. So in this scenario, we're going to create one called analog active, and this is going to choose whether our mouse bindings we did on our analog are going to be enabled or not. So by default, on our analog active, they're going to be active and our test commands aren't. And we're going to go back to the default one, in which case they're not going to be active. Okay, and another thing that was recently updated with FoxVox as well is you can, next to the configuration, select which configuration is going to be the default when you launch the library. In previous versions of FoxVox, when you close the application, it just remembered which configuration was last selected, and that's the one it used to default. But you couldn't necessarily specify which one you wanted, and this allows you to do that. So another nice addition that's been put into the version 2.0. Okay, so the first thing we want, let's put a button to control our switching between the default to the analog enabled commands. Let's see here. Let's use a different button. Let's go with button 5. Okay, so when we click this button, we're going to switch over to our mouse controls. And let's go ahead and create one on. We're going to use the same button. Get rid of the axis. We're going to use the same button, but this time we're going to double click it to return. And we're going to switch that back to the default. Okay, so we've got two buttons defined. That's going to change. When we single click, it's going to enable our analog and disable the test keys, and then switch us back on the configuration when we double click. Let's go ahead and give that a try. Okay, so now we have mouse control, and we want to go back, double click that, and now I have no mouse control. Back to mouse control, and no mouse control. Okay, so anyway, you can see how you can use configurations to enable and disable groups of commands. You can also use it for individual commands as well on a group. So those are also stored with configuration settings as well. You can have an unlimited number of configurations and an unlimited number of commands and groups. So do it however you want to do it. There's a lot of flexibility with what you want to do in FoxVox. For the next example, I want to show what can kind of happen with some different audio feedback and some control that you can do there. So to do this one, let's go ahead and create a new group, and then let's put in a new key command and filter that out. Let's go with our button, And when we click this button, we're going to have different audio responses based on the button. Well, actually we're going to go based on some chants. So I'll show you how a couple of these settings can be used. Okay, the first one we're going to do, we're going to bind a sound file. So we're going to have 3 different audio responses. This is going to be audio response 1. And let's set the chance of this to be 33%. So 1 out of 3 chance. And if it does run, we don't want to run any other commands below it. Okay, for the next one, let's choose audio response number 2. Oops. And if the first one doesn't go, this one's going to have a 50% chance of activating. And let's go with another response. Response 3. And this one's going to have a 100% chance of executing if we get down into it. Okay, so now what's going to happen based on what I've set up is when we press button 9, we're going to get 1 out of 3 responses. And we're going to get them randomly. We don't know which one we're going to get. We're going to get either 1, which has a 30% chance, 2, which is then 50-50 between the 2 and 3, or 3, which is finally the ultimate response we'll get. So let's just give that a whirl here. Okay, there's one response. Oh, we picked a different one. And there we've heard the third. So it's pretty cool. You can have some randomized outputs based on a button. How you set this up is up to you, and how many choices you have is up to you. But by setting the randomized chance and having the stop execution built into it so it prevents anything further, once it gets onto a command that's been set, you can actually have several different responses, and you can randomize a lot of your interactions. So that gives you a lot of flexibility, some good interactivity potentials with games, particularly with voice responses when you want to speak with somebody and have a response back that may be different, and you don't know what the response is. Let's just say, for example, in a flight sim and BMS, if you've got a response back, you have a question, should we use the alternate airbase? And you may get a response yes, you may get a response no. You don't know necessarily which one you're going to get in game. You can throw those onto the commands and sort of enhance the things that you do. So again, a lot of flexibility with what's built in, and your imagination is the limit. So we've been able to go over several of the features of FoxVox, and especially the new command and key binding, show you how that's basically done. There's a lot of time we could spend probably showing all the different combinations that are possible by doing that, but that's really up to you. Go ahead and grab yourself a free copy of the software. It's available for download. A big thanks to all those who have supported my work and appreciate the donations that you've given me. And I'm glad I was able to bring this new release and this new edition of FoxVox out that basically is kind of a full suite software now with the voice and key output combined. So anyway, I hope you like the functionality. Again, thanks. And if you really like it, feel free to leave a comment on the itch.io community page and let us know how you're using it. If you have a library that you've designed for a game that you want to share there, just give me a post and we can find a way to get that put up there for anybody else. And thanks for watching.